Okay, back from break. This is going a little quicker, but I have something that I want to go back to in Colossians before we close it out. So let's get through the rest of chapter 4 and some of the amazing things that are going on here. Okay, so after we start here in verse 7 of chapter 4, and he's basically giving a commendation to Tychicus or Tychicus, all right, who has a very interesting name. His name means fortuitous. That means that, when things just happen to come together perfectly, it's fortuitous, all right, one of the meanings. And he says, all my state shall Tychicus declare unto you. He's a beloved brother and a faithful minister and a fellow servant in the Lord. So he's setting Tychicus in as someone to be reckoned with, to be heard, understood, as a leader, as a servant, and as a minister. Remember what I said about setting in the congregation. And he says, whom I've sent to you for the same purpose, that he might know your estate and comfort your hearts. He's setting him in as a pastoral. This apostle is setting in a pastoral leadership in the church or the congregation at Colossae. That's what's going on here. And he says with Onesimus. Remember, Onesimus was the servant who ran to get Paul and the guys. And there were some guys with him. You're going to find out about those guys too. All right? And said, and Onesimus' name, remember, means very useful, helpful person. Well, of course he was. He helped get this thing going. And he said, he's a beloved brother, and he's one of you, which means, again, servant or not, neither Jew nor Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, there's God is no respecter of persons. I don't care what his estate is. His estate means his stature in life, what he's doing. All right? He's saying he's one of you. Don't forget it. That's that humility and humbleness and kindness of spirit that we read earlier in chapter 3. All right? And he says, and they shall make known unto you all things which are done here. Anything that you don't understand, these two, the messenger and the pastor, are going to teach you and help you to understand these things. We're setting them into the leadership at this congregation. Pay attention. That's what he's saying. All right? He's covering them like the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. They are now covered as an apostle covers that congregation. It's his headship. All right? And he's there to lay down the foundations of orderly conduct, set in establishing leaders, teachers, pastors, evangelists, prophets, as they come and as they grow, and making sure that there's no bad doctrine sneaking in. Remember, wolves creeping in unawares, spreading false doctrine, destroying from the inside, especially young churches like this, young believers. That's why he's saying Tychicus and Onesimus, they got it together. And that's what we're setting up right now. So, he's saying all these things are done here. Then he mentions some other folks. He says in verse 10, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, salutes you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom you received commandments. If he comes to you, receive him. And then Jesus or Yeshua, whose name is called Justice, who are of the circumcision, they're Jews. These only are my fellow workers unto the kingdom of God, which have been a comfort unto me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of the Messiah, salutes you, always laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. He sets the congregation in and the leaders He says, and you got to pray for them. Remember, when you're doing nothing, you don't get attacked. When you're doing something, the attacks come. And he says, for I bear him record that he hath a great zeal for you, and them that are in Laodicea, and them in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Well, you know it's my practice in how I was taught to study many, many years ago, and I mean many years ago. When I look at names and everything and I see a pattern developing, I go in and I say, okay, let's take a look. What do these names mean? What's the significance here? So the names, I told you, Tychicus or Tychicus, however it's said, means fortuitous. When you take Aristarchus, Marcus, Barnabas, Yeshua, Justus, Epaphras, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Luke, Demas, Nymphas, and Archippus. All right, because it says, salute the brethren which are in Laodicea and Nymphas, and the church in his house. He goes on, continues on, all right, and he says, and when this epistle is read among you, cause it be read also to the church in Laodicea, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea, sharing information, all right, and say to Archippus, take heed the ministry which thou hast received in the Lord, that thou fulfill it. And he ends with saying, the salutation by the hand of me, Paul. Remember my bonds. Grace be with you. Amen. All right. Before we get into those names, I want to say something about Paul, and it's significant to the names. It has often been understood or misunderstood. Let's say I said earlier that there's almost like a split. Folks that say, well, it was really Paul that said in Christianity, and he differed from Jesus, Yeshua, the Messiah. They're always trying to cause some kind of nonsense. All right, look, let's be frank. Rather, let's be Paul. All right, Paul runs into this guy on the street. He goes blind for 3 days. Can't see nothing. He's a Pharisaical leader who actually persecuted his own people and those that were not, that were Christians that followed Messiah, until he had that engagement with the Messiah himself. Basically knocked them blind, ping, for 3 days. He didn't see anything, but he was taught a lot. He comes out of that. So you're Paul, right? I'm Paul. Come out of that. Do you think for a minute, that I'm going to go off on my own direction? This guy was the 13th apostle, replacing the one that betrayed Yeshua. The only reason he's there is because Lord said he cannot betray. He's not going to allow that betrayal. He says he couldn't if he says I'm the cornerstone and the rest of the foundation is the teachings and the foundations of the apostles, the apostolic teaching. It couldn't be. So no matter what you read, all these academicians and all these wise guys and this philosopher and that philosopher, Paul did nothing that he wasn't directed to do by Yeshua himself. Get it? Anything else is nonsense. And I'm going to tell you, he wasn't a rogue like people say, out and doing what he wants, said what he wants. He was doing what he was told. Now listen, just before we get into the names, there were 2 names that he mentioned, all right, that I want you to take a look at. First one, it says in verse 10, he says, and Marcus, okay? Do you know who Marcus was? Mark, the guy that wrote the Gospel of Mark, an apostle. Remember, you go out in 2. And then he goes on to say later on in verse 14, and Luke, the beloved physician, the guy that wrote the Gospel of Luke, and probably Acts. He was Luke the physician, also apostolic. He wasn't a rogue. Forget all that nonsense. Here's proof positive what was going on here. Everything in order. He never deviated from what the Messiah did, lived, and showed. If he had, you'd think he would have gotten away with this guy escaped everything, every prison, every this, every that. They tried to kill him. They snuck him out in baskets like you're watching the movies. This guy was like hunted like a dog. Why? Because he left Pharisaical Judaism for this, which was the biggest threat to the establishment in Jerusalem at the time. It was bad enough they had the Romans to deal with, bad enough they had Arabs to deal with that were enforcing things that the Romans couldn't because they didn't have that many men over there in Jerusalem. Remember, they hired all the locals. They didn't like the Jews anyway. Enmity, right? Isaac and Ishmael. Here it is. So he was not a rogue. He was with it completely. All right? Now we'll go to those names. The names in order. Aristarchus, Marcus, Barnabas, Yeshua, or Justus, Epaphras, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Luke, Demas, Nymphas, and Archippus. Here's what they mean, top to bottom. I hope this is a blessing for you. It was for me. He is the chief ruler, the prince, the shining son of the prophets. He is God's salvation. Just in case you didn't think we were talking about Yeshua, that's what his name is. He was God's salvation, dedicated to love, uprightness, and justice. He is from the common people and from the sacred city and the temple. He is light, the leader of the common people, his bride, to whom he shows kindness. How much do we talk about kindness? What's expected of us? We read it over and over again. It was mentioned last week, and even in this message. That's a remarkable. I'm going to read it one more time. I want you to listen closely. That's what these names translate to, okay, in Hebrew. He is the chief ruler, the prince, the shining son of the prophets. He is God's salvation, dedicated to love, being upright and justice. He is from the common people, all right, from the city, the sacred city, and the temple. He is light, the leader of the common people, his bride, to whom he shows kindness. Well, I'll be. Never ceases to amaze. And I really, really wanted to get that across to you and bring that understanding out. You see, today, all the geniuses out there have theories about God and this and that and end times and everything. But I can tell you, no matter how brilliant and no matter how cogent sometimes the thought and the logic is, if you start from a premise that's incorrect or error, you're off the tracks already. And much of it has. But amidst that, we're in a situation now, even in this country, where they say God has been taken from this and that. There are two things that are loggerheads. You can't have the things that they're trying to push on us in this world and have God too. They can't get what they want until they obliterate God, get them out of everything. These are facts. And it's been that way for a long time. So if they pretend there is no God, then no one will be able to talk about, understand, or hear. I mean, I looked at the absurdity of this. There was a Supreme Court ruling this week about a gentleman, a high school football coach, who decided after the game he was going to kneel in prayer. All right? And they tried to take him to court. They threw him out of his job, everything. Well, the Supreme Court ruled on it. He said, wait a minute. And and they ruled in favor of this guy as a violation of his constitutional rights. But I looked at it even as that, but also in a different vein. If you can't pray to your God, anyone of any particular faith, in a place like a ball field, what's next? That means you can't pray in what they call a public space. Remember, public means funded by the public's tax dollars. All right? The government administers the funds and does what they're supposed to sometimes. All right? Take a look at your roads. You'll see how much they do with them, with your money and infrastructure. But that would mean that any place that the government money is touched, you'd have to do hopscotch to say prayers in between hopping from one street corner to a sidewalk to your own property. Anywhere that money touches becomes public. I mean, what's next? After a ball field? A guy after a game, nobody's around, decides to pray. He's not telling anybody else to do what he's got to do. He's doing it. Just like you and I. That's the kind of struggle that's going on. Thank God they ruled the right way. Otherwise, you couldn't even pray and you couldn't even whisper, because they'll claim that they own the air too, that you breathe. And it's not that much of an exaggeration the way things are going. But anyway, I wanted to go back to Colossians chapter 3 rather, and where are we? Here we go. It was chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. All right? And I want to take a look at that again and go in just a little amplification. It says, if you're risen with the Messiah, seek those things that are above, where the Messiah sits on the right hand. Set your affection on those things above, not the things on earth, because you're dead to that. And your life is now hid, very important word, hid, with the Messiah in God. And when the Messiah, who is our life, shall appear, then you all shall appear with him. And basically, he's appear with him. He's appearing in the clouds. All right? It says that very clearly. However, what is our understanding of clouds, really? They have multifunction. On one hand, it could mean you got your head in the clouds. You know, the old saying was, we used to say, you're so spiritually minded, you know earthly good, or vice versa. It could mean that. But on the other hand, and remember, the word is a double-edged sword. You know, we can certainly embrace the idea of, in this cloud, there's a vision of a larger goal, a more noble one. If your head is in that cloud, that your mind is not communicating a lack of focus, but rather a vision and an energy going forward. You don't want to be disconnected from the real world, but on the other hand, it implies that you have a firm grasp on a situation, and you're driving hard to change it and understand it. So we have to really describe who we are in that sense. But the word clouds here, clouds are a covering. Remember how God appeared to Moses. He said, up in the mountains, and all the people down below could see and hear was the thunder and the lightning and a cloud. All right, and then when Israel left Egypt, God provided them what? A cloud. It was a covering. But in the cloud, God himself. Now, why is that? Well, we've said it more than a few times in the past. Man cannot be in the presence of God or see God as God and live. It's replete in Scripture, so he puts a cloud, a mist between us, such that it doesn't hurt us. He covers us. Cloud is a covering, a protection. It's something we need, okay? And it's something that he provides. Just like he says, there are a cloud of witnesses. That's very significant too, because a cloud also represents like an army. Okay? And that's exactly what he says. Because when we go back into Colossians, he said, you're going to come and return with him. He's going to appear, and you're going to appear with him. Why? Because as we learned in Revelation, that's the first resurrection. All right? The dead shall be raised in the Messiah first, and then those which remain next. That's rapturing, taking out, carrying away. Now, a lot of theologians, the battles rage on and on about what's the time lag here and what's this and that. Remember, they're all stuck on that tribulation business. That's where they just stepped off the cliff and went all the way to the bottom. There's nothing to it. It's not true. So the rest of it gets pretty mixed up. But it says you're going to return in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. What we don't understand, that in the physics of God and where he is everywhere, it's just a thought. I remember having this discussion with a good friend of mine who was a pastor many, many, many years ago. He says, well, the time in between. I said, what makes you think there's any time in between? Boom! In a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, all of that happens. Raised, poof. It's not some long belabored thing like there's a line of Israelites walking out of Egypt coming through the Red Sea. No. He says they'll greet you in the clouds and they will return together. All right? And the clouds, they're not just a simple meteorological context, in the references that we have. And there's not that many references to clouds in all of Scripture, quite honestly. All right? Elijah knew, and a lot of it had to do with observing nature. All right, Elijah knew, just like anybody else, that if a cloud came in from over the sea, it was going to rain. There were clouds in and around Jerusalem and in the Holy Land. They're dry season. And they don't rain at all, but they're there. All right, those are the high cirrus clouds from the desert. They're rainless clouds, and we know that from Jude, verse 12. And when was the first mention of clouds in the Bible? Well, it was when the rainbow transcended the clouds after the flood, when the waters receded and the rain stopped. And it was the establishment of the Noachic covenant, that same Noachic covenant that Paul and company said, don't worry about all these ordinances with these new people that are coming into faith. Teach them the Noachic code, the one that God first gave to me. That's bring them in, walk before you run, crawl before you walk. That's what he was saying. Don't lose them with all this stuff that you're not even supposed to be really doing. Get them in, get them to understand the Noachic covenant. That's the first time that we saw a mention of clouds, Genesis 9, verses 12 through 17. All right? When Exodus, like I said, when after they left, the Israelites left Egypt and were wandering around the desert for 40 years, their journey is marked by that pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, okay? And this is representing God's presence, but also his hiddenness. Remember I said you'll be hid with him. Remember I said before, pay attention to the word hid. You're hidden with him in the cloud until the revelation. Yes, same revelation in the book of Revelation. Remember that. The people that are left laying around here don't believe at all. The line in the sand has been drawn. And now it's time for a reckoning. All right. In the wilderness, God instructed Israel on how they would worship him, how they would do this. It was a mobile sanctuary because they were wandering. And again, all right, God makes his presence known at the tabernacle. How? In a cloud that fills the most holy part of this tabernacle building. You can see it in Exodus 33, 9 and 10. Exodus 40, verses 34 through 38. Leviticus chapter 16, verses 2. Numbers chapter 9, 15 through 23. All right? This is what happened. The cloud was the presence of God to Israel. They could not look upon him. but his presence was known because he was in that cloud, filling the place with God's glory. All right? Clouds serve as God's war chariot, if you will, in the imagination of Old Testament poets and prophets. They give this analogy and present it like it is his chariot because they roll. Have you ever seen rolling clouds? And this is what they see in the spirit, that this chariot is an ancient one, and it goes way back, way back. But the biblical writers associate clouds primarily with the appearance of the one true God. All right, and sometimes they explore other aspects of clouds. We talked about that, but he also makes it very clear. All right, and in the New Testament, New Covenant particularly, the use of the cloud theme returns to one of a theophanic one, which is again God hidden in plain sight. All right. At the Transfiguration, which we spoke of a week or so ago, when Yeshua was there with Moses and Elijah, God spoke out of a cloud to identify Yeshua. He said, "My son, whom I have chosen," Luke 9:35. And just like God in the Old Covenant rides on a cloud in the New in Acts 1, verse 9. And in fact, one of the most pervasive images of the Messiah's return is as one who rides his cloud chariot into battle, okay? Into battle. And we'll take a quick look at some of these passages that we're talking about in the New Covenant. Hold on a second. We'll open up to the book of Matthew. All right, first gospel. And we will go to Matthew 24, which, by the way, is significant in end times teaching. Matthew 24, Luke 21 lay out all of these things, and that's taught where the temple is destroyed. But he looks in Matthew 24, verse 30, and he says, "And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven," listen, "with power and great glory." Power and great glory. In Mark, the second gospel, chapter 13, okay, verse 26. Let's shoot over there real quick. Matthew 13:26 says, "And then on the second coming, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory." All right? It's consistent everywhere. And it's the same in chapter 14, verse 62. Okay? It says, "And Yeshua said, I am." He just identified himself as one with the Father. "And you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." Same as we see in Revelation 1:7, Daniel 7:13, Luke 21:27. This is what we see. The cloud. A cloud of great witnesses. All coming. The chariot of God. The surprise in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. When the cloud gathers, he says, "Watch and look, for my time is near." Anyway, that brings us to the end of our study here on Colossians, and we're almost to the end of the hour. So I want to thank you once again for enduring the study. I hope we brought out some things that will just magnify the power and the glory and the truth of this word. So, as we always do, we leave together. We find grace in God, grant grace to one another, chesed, mercy, and peace. May he who makes peace in high places make peace for you. See you next week. Toodaloo.